Welcome everybody to the CST webinar. But thank you for coming today to listen to this really interesting topic on anticipatory governance. This is on the back of an online course that Tanja, Geci, and a few of us at the CST have put together on what anticipatory governance is and how we can apply it in the Southern African context. There's some case studies from work that some Tanja and Geci have been involved in, and others in the continent and internationally. So this webinar is really an opportunity to kind of dig down into what this concept means, and just for Tanja and Geci to share on some of their work around this. So we welcome you here, and I think I'll hand over to Tanja and Geci, who can introduce themselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Joy. Thank you for organizing this, and especially now that the course is underway. And it's lovely to have Geci, because she and I have worked together for a long time now on all sorts of weird and wonderful things, mostly around strategic foresight. But collaborating on this with regard to anticipatory governance is sort of, I think, a little step further along the path of sort of really starting to produce work and do things for which there's a great need. And nobody needs to say, oh, well, you know, we've got COVID, or we've had COVID, so now we all realize how really important it is to be more anticipatory. It's because there's so many other systemic shocks, especially in our region, sort of built into the system. So having a way of talking about these and having a way to start thinking about this is really super cool. And I'm really keen, once we get past the sort of preliminary what this is stuff, just quickly, because I'm going to, if you haven't done the course, going to absolutely recommend everybody to do the course, and we have a bit of conversation. The bit I'm really interested in, and I'm sure my colleagues are as well, is to hear from you. You know, what are you spotting? What are you seeing in terms of some of these principles of anticipatory governance being applied, maybe some case studies? It doesn't have to be a full-on absolutely whole thing, you know, even if you're just seeing small signs. And the reason we like small signs, and what in Futures talk, it's weak signals. In CST talk, it is little seeds and little pockets of the future in the present. Where are we starting to see these little experiments of anticipatory governance in the region? It's that specifically that we're interested in, because we're quite slick now, I think, with this methodology of focusing on these pockets of the future in the present, these seeds, and then seeing how one really goes to work with them in terms of starting to create visions and images and ideas of preferred futures. And you know, that's the sort of powerful and empowering part of this work. So we'd love to hear from you as well. Let me do the, I was supposed to introduce myself. Tanja Hichert, I'm literally a practitioner, a strategic foresight and futures practitioner. I'm really blessed and lucky enough to have a strong working relationship, and I'm a fellow at Center for Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. And that's also a place where there is room for working creatively and experimentally in terms of some of the methods and tools and approaches we have and that we're seeing at the moment. And to be honest, I think there's some really cool stuff that we're seeing on the continent coming to the fore. And I hand over to Geci to introduce herself.
Thanks, Tanja, and hi, everybody. It's great to be here with you. My name is Geci Karuri Sebina. And so, as Tanja has mentioned, we've done plenty of things over the years together, one of which we share to this day is that we're both part of the Southern African Node for the Millennium Project. And that's always a great space for thinking about the future. I'm also an associate professor at the Wits School of Governance. And a lot of my other work has really been very much in the urban space over the last 20 years, but it's inevitably all become about the future, hasn't it? So that's really become an interesting convergence in my life. I used to straddle the two, and now the two are one. Great to be here, and really glad to be in conversation with Tanja and with all of you.
Okay, super. I'm going to get the mechanics over and done with. So do a quick screen share and there we go. I've made a pretty title slide. And can you just give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Cool. Some definitions. Just starting with governance. What is regular governance? And I love this definition. It's Robert Bourgeois, who's a colleague, who was with the Center for Governance Innovation at University of Pretoria for a while. He's based in, oh goodness, I think he's based in Senegal now, or Cote d'Ivoire, I'm not sure, one of the two. In any event, Robert has this much broader definition, the system of principles, this is governance, the system of principles related to rules of implementation a society is using to manage itself in order to deliver the public goods it wants. I love this because it's broad, it's really broad, and it takes us away from that sort of knee-jerk view we always tend to have, that governance is something that people in government departments, you know, whether it be national or regional or local, you know, governance is something that people in government departments do. And if you're living in South Africa at the moment, and a lot of this government's departments and governance and stuff is really falling over in terms of the load shedding. I don't usually complain ever about things, but this load shedding has been driving us nuts. Anyhow, this system of principles and related rules that we use to manage ourselves, I really like that. Another way of looking at regular governance, structures and processes by which people in societies make decisions and share power and responsibilities, and can involve both public and private actors engaging in the development, implementation, and application of principles, rules, norms, and institutions that guide both social and socio-ecological interactions. Now, that is a very, very comprehensive definition. It comes from the Handbook for Methods on Socio-Ecological Systems that was published recently. It's open source. It's a wonderful handbook. I can really recommend it. It's part of the recommended reading when you do the course. So here again, you can see broader and incorporating the interactions that happen in socio-ecological systems. So bringing in this whole view of it's not just human-made institutions or rules or whatever. It's the context and the world and nature that we live in and how we interact with that. So the point I'm trying to make is that governance is something really, really important. When it comes to anticipatory governance, and there you see, again, definitions, looking at that, it's governing, so taking the above into consideration, in the present to adapt to or shape uncertain futures. And just absolutely the 101 of futures is the future doesn't exist. The things that give rise to futures exist. And we can't study the future, but we most certainly can study driving forces of change, the nature of change. We can study the kind of the decisions we make, how we're making sense of the world around us, the crises, the drama, that all we can study. But the future itself doesn't exist. We cannot study the future. But uncertain futures, most certainly something we can be working with. So anticipatory governance, a new approach to policy making that enables, and I put in brackets there, governments, to effectively address complex problems and uncertainty with new tools and instruments. Now, again, this enormous emphasis on complex problems, very different from a complicated problem and very different from the kind of cause and effect, easy to label, sort out, figure out a solution problem that we tend to have at the forefront when we address things. Complex problems, often wicked as well. New tools and instruments, extremely important. And, you know, we'd love to hear from you as well. What have you been using? What have you been exposed to? What is out there that can help us become better at governance? And then another definition, a system of institutions, rules, and norms that provides a way to use foresight, networks, and feedback for the purpose of reducing risk and increasing capacity to respond to events at an earlier rather than later stages of development. Now here, really a very strong risk focus and risk reduction focus. And if you've attended the course, Professor Debart van Niekerk is really great at applying this risk reduction approach and bringing anticipatory governance into that. And he's written a really nice paper on that as well. And then the final one, a flexible decision framework. And I really love that because, you know, decision frameworks are not set in stone and they shouldn't be. So this a flexible decision framework, anticipatory governance, that uses a wide range of possible futures to prepare for change. And, you know, these days in strategic foresight and future studies and everything, we're in the space now of preposterous futures as well, not just possible or plausible. So the fact that you've got this flexible decision framework that can really work with a wide range of possible futures to prepare for change. Again, so the purpose of reducing risk, to prepare for change, and to guide current decisions towards maximizing future alternatives or minimizing future threats. So there's a practical aspect to this as well. So just very quickly, in a nutshell, and this is sort of cobbled together from some of the work of Fritz Nganje, who's also part of the course, and Leon Firth, an American who was sort of one of the fathers of the concept anticipatory governance. It's built on the understanding that complexity and uncertainty, you would have heard the terminology VUCA, VUCA's volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, cannot be managed, but it can be better navigated through a systems approach that combines capacities for forecasting, foresighting, visioning, as well as collaborative and participatory processes. Now, hugely important, collaborative and participatory. Okay, so really, really stepping away from big man politics, hierarchical decisions, some people know better, expertise, to anticipate and respond to the challenges that come with rapid and unpredictable change. And of course, we are smack in the middle of rapid and unpredictable change for reasons no other than the fact that we're entering a neogeological epoch, the Anthropocene. And if you haven't heard about it yet, it is our human activities that have come from the last 10,000 years or so in this very stable, wonderful climate that we've had, the Holocene. Our human activities are affecting planetary systems. That is the Anthropocene, and it is causing massive change and effects. And we're going to have to step up and just be a lot better at coping with that, at navigating it, mitigating where possible. But then the big thing is adapting and becoming resilient. So 4 main components to anticipatory governance model: a foresight system, so analyzing and visualizing, imagining alternative futures, because remember, the future doesn't exist. A network system of governance that allows for the integration of this foresight into policy processes. So anticipatory governance is not if you have a government department and there is maybe even a minister or a director general or somebody who's responsible for strategic foresight, and that's it. That's what they do. And every year they write a report and they do some fancy planning. Okay, that's not anticipatory governance. A feedback system to gauge performance and manage institutional knowledge. That whole thing about learning. Are we learning from how we respond, how we interact with our socio-ecological systems? And as well as an open-minded institutional culture. It's an approach for navigating change that not only builds the capacity to recover from shocks and adapt to new realities, but also to transform, innovate, and even help shape new systems. And Geci, I wonder whether you shouldn't come in here and maybe just link this to futures literacy. And I'm going to stop sharing because that whole thing about resilience, not just being about being able to withstand shocks and recover from disaster, but resilience being the ability to innovate, to transform, and how that is connected to futures literacy, and that both of these are crucial elements and characteristics of anticipatory governance.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Tanja. And this was great background for everybody. I hope they appreciated that. You have a wonderful way of collapsing the content into really sharp insight into what it means. I think what I would add is, so futures literacy tends to speak to this point about needing to be a little bit more aware about our anticipatory assumptions, so the things we assume and perhaps aren't conscious that we assume about the present, about the future. And then also that fits within an anticipatory system that, again, we're not always aware of. Now, the issue with that is that if you're not consciously aware about how you're thinking about the future, there's two risks that are possible, and some of these tend to weigh very much in the space of strategic foresight. The one is that you become a little bit less humble about the future because you think you can do something about it, and you don't realize, if you want, the kind of lunacy of that. Now, obviously, it doesn't mean that there's nothing you can do, and I think that's where strategic foresight is absolutely right. We've got tools and ways to at least think about different possibilities and think about how we act, but in fact, the focus and the point of thinking about the future is to understand how to act in the present. So some humility about your ability to control everything in the future is really important. Otherwise, you enter this, what I use the word delusion is a bit extreme, but you enter this space where you really begin to think that you can control everything and ensure certain outcomes are achieved. And that's where the lack of humility becomes a problem, because those are big blinkers. Even if you enter scenario exercises that play with those, it doesn't help to simply expand the blinkers and still really believe that you now understand the future and can act in full confidence that you've got everything, right? So humility becomes important. You don't actually, and you can't actually control everything about the future. And so you've got to understand your assumptions that lead you to thinking that. The second thing is it limits your imagination. So again, if you frame the world only like this, you also begin to think your option space is only like this. And this is where Tanja is introducing the concept of really needing to be innovative, imaginative, inventive, if you want, in ways that sometimes a limited view and assumptions that give you a very limited view about your agency and about possibility. So if you begin to think, when you hear people say like, that's impossible, or that could never happen, or that'll never work. Those are assumptions that people are holding that come from somewhere, your socialization or your discipline, or some place that form a system you're fitting within that really refuses you to see and imagine anything different. So what futures literacy tries to do is to really bring in those constructs, if you want, of the mind into futuring, so that you're a little bit more aware that those systems, those assumptions are also important, not just the tools and not just the things that I think futures and foresight disciplines have evolved into offering you. That does fit into, if you want, some cognitive sense of how you're thinking about the future, and that itself can be extremely limiting and extremely dangerous if you're not careful.
Geci, thank you so much for that. And it's a great note just to, and this is the final slide, and just put up that other slide, which talks to what are the principles of anticipatory governance. And then I guess after that, it would be just lovely to open up the conversation, wouldn't it? So let's look at some of these principles, and all compliments to Marelise Dupree. Geci, you've worked with her a little bit as well. She and I did a huge project on post-COVID futures in the agriculture sector. And part of that was how can you be practical about anticipatory governance? And Marelise did this wonderful work in terms of looking at the literature and coming up with these principles for anticipatory governance. So look at that, integrating foresight and policy, right? So we don't ditch strategic foresight. We most certainly we use it and integrate it, but absolutely everything to what you said now, we start becoming very humble and we realize it's not my way or the highway. We practice long-termism, incorporate a complex systems perspective, and that's what's so nice about the course, by the way. Rika Preiser is just brilliant at, again, the practicalities and the application of complexity. How do you go about working with this stuff? Harnessing collective intelligence, and I guess there's some interesting conversations to be had there. And then having networked governance and distributed capabilities. So, I mean, literally, this sounds simplistic, but there's a lot to it. Don't have all your eggs in one basket. And then this little think like a system, act like an entrepreneur. And what I love about that, it's written up, it's in the course material, just a sort of a little explanation in more detail about what that means. But for me, the essence is, it's about being experimental, about having an entrepreneur, taking a chance, experimenting, learning from that. That's the next point. Practice adaptive learning, changing how you do things. And then finally, resilience. And again, just the emphasis here. Resilience is not about just having fat in the system so that, if there's drama, you're able to respond quickly. Resilience is not about being robust enough that you can withstand shocks and then recover. Resilience, when there is large-scale systemic transformative change, is being able to surf that wave and change proactively. And these are the kind of the principles. And using these principles, it would just be wonderful to hear what's out there, what are people's experience. Geci, any comments from you before we sort of open things up?
No, really, really happy that you shared that. I mean, I'll be happy to share the one little case study from our side, from the little, the emergency governance study, but maybe let's open up, or as you wish, and how it might pick up on some of those principles.
I love your study because it touches on so many elements of these. So I wonder whether you shouldn't throw that in the pot to start off with.
Okay, so I'll try and just maybe jump straight to what the study was about and what the lessons were, because I think those are what really touch nicely on the principles. And so this was a study we were asked to do as part of State of City reporting in South Africa. And it was really a question about what did we learn from the emergency governance framework that we've got in the country and COVID having happened, because COVID wasn't the first emergency or disaster or crisis we've had in the country. In fact, we've had almost steamrolling crises over time, both the global ones as well as very local ones. And in fact, we chose to look for cases of cities or spaces that had very specific crisis events that they dealt with not long before COVID. So the Cape where Tanja is no stranger to crises. It's everything from fires to droughts to, and so we spoke to the Western Cape about this. My province, Gauteng, which is where Johannesburg is, also, we'd had xenophobic violence flaring up every couple of years. And so that's the issue we asked about there. We've had parts of the country where there've been cholera breakouts. We've had parts of the countries where there've been flooding and tornadoes. And so what we did is we took a few of these and we began to say, okay, so if we begin to see crises as part of an ongoing set of crises that in fact we've been governing around in a country that in fact does have a disaster management framework, what do we learn about our ability to deal with crises? A fantastic question about anticipatory governance, right? Because we're right here. And so here are the big lessons that came out of it. So some of them are very local, I won't spend time on, and I've just opened the document in front of me. The one was that a lot of people don't do, in the governance space, don't do what they ought to do in crisis because they're worried about bureaucracy. So this is a very South African issue in the way that I'm framing it, but I'm sure it's the same everywhere else. People here, we talk about unfunded mandates and we talk about audit findings and queries. And often you found that officials were more concerned with that sometimes than they were with responding appropriately, even if they knew what the appropriate response was to crisis. So there is something about standardization and bureaucracy that's necessary as part of government, but there is something about it that often also stands in the face of the kind of entrepreneurialism and responsiveness that one is talking about when one talks of resilience.
And that trade-off, sorry to interrupt, Geci, because it's that trade-off that Fritz covers so nicely in his paper. So those of you that haven't done the course, check that out.
That's a fantastic one. Thanks, Tanja. The second one was, and it's almost contradicting the first in some ways, was that in fact, where we do have legislation and structures that had been established that ought to have been useful, they were bypassed for some reason. And this is something actually the paper says is very curious. We have a National Disaster Management Act, and it's very clear about what should happen. But for some reason, our national government decided to create or resort to what we call the NatJoC and the NatJoin structures, which really are defense structures to respond to a health pandemic. And so in some cases, perhaps the bureaucracy and the legislation isn't wrong, but for whatever reason, either panic or perhaps we rely on the things we trust and know. Maybe that's the issue, and South Africa has a particular history with defense and taking security measures, even about health issues. And so I think there's a really curious thing there about culture, perhaps, and about what we trust when the so-called shit hits the fan. And this was a case where we clearly bypassed what perhaps made sense in terms of bureaucracy and structure and resorted to something else. And some people would say that certain challenges emerged, such as failing to see the social and health dimensions of the crisis and really beginning to police people.
And look at the enormous consequences of that. I mean, yeah.
Exactly. Another big one was, and I like the point you were making around relationships, because it's a very big relationship that comes, a point that comes up here, which is that emergency governance, in fact, relies on all of society, and it relies heavily on relationships, which take time to build.
Yeah.
So Andrew Boraine, who's around the block from Tanja there in the Cape, who heads up something called the Western Cape Economic Development Partnership, does a fantastic little piece where he distinguishes between partnerships and relationships. And he says, we've talked in governance for so long about partnerships, and we need to understand that there's a difference between partnering and having a relationship with somebody, especially institutionally. And when there is crisis, the relationship is what matters, because a partnership, you can choose to partner or not to partner. We've got to talk about what are the terms, what am I getting, what are you getting? A relationship suggests that when something happens, and Tanja, I know I need you, and you trust that I'll do, be there. And you're just going to do it, not start pulling up the MOU and telling me whether clause 3 addresses this issue, And I think there's a very big point there that is completely aligned with these anticipatory governance principles that speaks to that. And so there were many other issues, the lack of these long-term risk reduction strategies. So when you say the long-termism, why do we sometimes, in this case, at a city level, lack those long-term strategies? Why are we only thinking in administrative terms? And so there are a few more of these, but I think those highlights I've pulled out really begin to show you how some of these cases really begin to demonstrate the importance, actually, of a more anticipatory approach in how we govern.
Geci, you must, as soon as that work of yours is published and vetted and available and everything, please do tell us, because then what we would like to do from our side is circulate it through our network and our stakeholders, because huge learnings to be had there. I think let's open up. It's exactly 1:30. That leaves us half an hour. We'd love to hear from you, and truly anything goes. But I would like to ask, if you have a question, just raise your hand so that it's slightly disciplined. I'm going to try and manage it. I'm not terribly good at this. And please put your camera on, because that is also a really good indication, and I suppose just makes this whole endeavor a little bit more human. Please share your thoughts. There we go. Hi, Romina.
Hello. Yes, thank you for the presentations. I'm calling in from Stockholm today, from Stockholm Museum Center. And yes, I really love the opportunity to join you here on the discussion of anticipatory governance today, because in the project we have been working on freshwater management and governance, and looking into visioning and how to develop and work on transformation scenarios. And currently we are writing this up together, actually. One's based on the work from Emily Boyd on anticipatory governance and social ecological resilience, with also the list of indicators that she collected, and linking it to the work from Claudia Pahl-Wossel on triple loop learning and governance. So being more explicit also on the long-termism that you mentioned before. And yes, we have tried and applied this on the empirical evaluation from our case of the Water Council, which is a body without a mandate, without money, but invited for through the European Water Framework Directive. And so it has the ability to bring in long-term thinking and bridging between sectoral and administrative boundaries.
Romina, same thing. Please share.
It's amazing to see so many dots being connected. So that's why I thought, wow, this is great how this could come together, because we also saw this lack of case studies where you can prove from practitioners, like, where would they engage? And I mean, the crisis situation that I would report from. I mean, it's nothing big, but I was just thinking of this small example, like once when there was a car ending in the lake. I mean, it's a really small thing, but people, because of the experience in the water council, know each other and had the direct phone number to whom to call, how to act. And it was not bureaucratic at all, just because of their experience and trust. So just a tiny example of this, but also highlighting that there is a space for long-term thinking. And with a triple loop learning, you can then see, okay, these kind of activities contribute to adaptation of current goals, other activities contribute to goal reframing. And then in a third loop, it is about questioning underlying norms and values. And that then might really lead to more transformative thinking and visioning. So that's what we have found, and hopefully finalizing the paper this year as well.
Brilliant. And I'm being serious. If you can, just pull that document into the chat box if you're able to do that. I'm not sure whether you're able to do that. Otherwise, email it along. Rhoda, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
Hello.
I'm sorry, I couldn't find the hand icon.
Not to worry. Putting your camera on is fine.
Anyway, I don't actually have a question. It's just very interesting to sit in this webinar. I find it really interesting because I've got a colleague of mine. We are working on governance of the UNESCO MAB program towards a report on governance systems of vice reserves all across the world. And I thought it connects to what you were talking about. And Geci is as a connection at Wits University. My colleague is from Wits University. And we're working with the UNESCO people and a colleague from Colombia. So interestingly, we haven't thought of the terminology of anticipatory governance. We're just calling it governance systems of vice reserves. So if you could maybe share some interesting papers to read on that, it will be very helpful for us. But we've got a very short deadline. Our report needs to be done by the end of January next year.
Rhoda, the thing to do, it's all open, it's all free. Just go to, and it's on the UNESCO Open Learning platform. The webinar would have given you a link to that course. And
yes.
Yes, and you don't have to watch all the videos and get the little certificate and whatever. By all means, sign up, click through the course, but that'll give you access to all of the links and all of the reading. And
okay.
So that's the easiest, that's the place to go now. And then what we
I
can
will do exactly that, yes.
Super. And there's also an opportunity, Geci, I think, to make some of this material available on Foresight for Development, which is an African, somebody's asking if we can send them the link to the course. Micah or Joy, I'm sure you could do that and put that in the chat box. Foresight for Development, it's been going for quite some years now, is a lovely platform collecting the work of African futurist and foresight practitioners. And I think we can make a little space there to put this work and sort of send you to there as well. Okay. I'm seeing hands. I see Nina's hand. Thank you, Rhoda.
Hi, Tanja. Hi there. I'm reading a group of governance practitioners, Matt Andrews, and they talk about capacity to implement governance. And when we talk about managing complex systems in the present and the future, we have like frameworks and approaches and design tools. But in the moment of enacting governance, there is the ability or inability to make decisions or deliberate properly, thoroughly, and with the right people. What are your ideas about building this capacity, not only within state structures, but in other structures? You know, we often have very good governance plans or protocols, or on paper it looks great, and then when we must do it, it's a bit of a mess. What are your thoughts about implementation and about building this capacity to implement?
This is so Geshi's section. Question.
So, I'm trained as a planner, even though I don't do very much planning anymore. And I often say that a plan can't really be that good if it's not implemented, because there would be something the planning ignored about either the capacity to implement or the ecosystem that allows for implementation. Clearly, something happens if a policy or a plan isn't implemented. And I think that's the first thing. And I think it probably links to a part of the point I think you're raising, Nina, that has to do with the engagement and who's having these conversations. I think that often, top-down things or things that perhaps don't really consider the actors themselves on an ongoing basis, not just when it comes to implementation, I think tend to have that failure. And so that's one of the strengths, in my view, of the anticipatory governance approach that really centers these points about collaboration, about participation, about the collective intelligence, and not just the intelligence of the expert or the most important person in the room. So I think part of the capability we have to build, and I often speak about the future, the processes of the future having to be different than the processes we've tended to have, which are very sort of, there's leadership and then there's others, there's government and then there's civil society, there's the C-suite and then there's the floor workers. These hierarchies are not implementation oriented at all. They in fact separate implementation from strategy or from planning or from policy. And I think anticipatory governance maybe is one of the frameworks that begins to say that, hang on guys, that's not going to work.
And just to mention, because I'm familiar with Matt Andrews's work, and it's brilliant in terms of complexity, because the adaptive approach, very big on incremental experimentation. A lot of things that anticipatory governance, networkability tries to cover. But Nina, I think the core of what is brought in is what Geci was referring to right at the beginning, is that anticipatory assumption. And the futures literacy, and literally incorporating that thing, if you want to call it that, about being able to imagine and then work with, and I hate this term, use the future, to bring the future in the present. It's that bit, I think, which anticipatory governance brings to some of the work that is also extremely valuable. I see Micah, I see your hand, and I see Stephen's hand, and I've got no idea who was first. Mike is going for it.
Yeah, I'm just going to go for it. Thank you. And sorry about the bathroom. I have a question that's a little bit more about maybe pushing this idea even further, potentially with people. And it's about the question of like, how creative can you get? And maybe reflecting a little bit on your experiences, Tanja and Geci, on, and maybe my own interest in sort of the art science interface and sort of science fiction and those things. Like what do you see the role of more, pushing futures towards the more implausible or outside of the norm, outside the box, sort of more out there visioning in anticipatory governance? I know it has a role that we also, we use it a lot in how we think about futures at the CST, but within the framework or within the setting of anticipatory governance, is that going a step too far? What is the role of the more creative sort of arts-based approaches in this kind of anticipatory governance approach?
I'll be super quick and then hand over again. It's huge and there's massive potential, because what it does, it's that expanded futures cone, preposterous futures. And Micah, it's because plausibility just doesn't cut it anymore. We ditched probability. Plausibility is not cutting it anymore because we're in this post-normal world. So we've got to be working with preposterous, crazy futures, because we're living in a preposterous, crazy now.
Yeah, absolutely. So mad futures are a thing. But in fact, actually, Mikey, there's, how do you pronounce your name? Mikey?
Micah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Micah. Okay, sorry. I get mispronounced a lot, so I'm very So Micah, there is a whole field now of speculative futures, and that's something you might want to look at, the design futures. And I think whereas at one stage it might have seemed fringe and, a couple of creatives just doing whatever, I think there's increasingly a greater appreciation of the value of that in that unblinkering that I was talking about. But also, I think a very important term to bring into this is the need for experimentation and trying things, especially in government and the public space. And so there are ideas about, things like living labs that maybe are not quite as mad and preposterous, but at least begin to suggest that there's a need to try some things and maybe to remove the box a little bit to allow some of these experiments to flourish. It becomes a very important way to be inclusive as well. Because if we're going to insist that the qualification for you to future is you must be a planner with a PhD in futures and foresight or whatever, then that already begins to suggest that there's a hierarchy in who knows more about the future. Well, the reality is nobody knows more. Some just have certain tools and the tools can differ. And that richness, I think, is what there is really great room for. So absolutely space for creative exploration, creative thinking in the future space, especially I think in these newer disciplines that are very open to that.
Stephen, calling Stephen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, there you are.
There we are. Hi, Tanja and Geci. Just a shout out to the course to everyone here. I took it as soon as it opened, rushed through it in 10 days. It's actually, they've done a very good job. I've done lots of online courses. So go through it. You can spend as much time as you want or the least amount of time, but there's really good articles. But Tanja interviews some fascinating people. And so highly, highly recommend the course. So shout out to all of you for that. So I have two questions for you, Tanja and Geci. How do we move this, not as a package, but how do we engage other sort of entities? So for my example, the CEO of the Kenya, I'm based here in Nairobi, the CEO of the Kenya National Innovation Agency, I told him about this and he was like all over it. Yeah. He says, Kenya needs to be involved in anticipatory governance. And it's like, great. So maybe we just have to have a separate conversation on the side, but I think there's a need for this. And the second component of that is how do we switch gears here? And again, this is my own personal need. I have a client that is setting up a humanitarian affairs unit. This is a large NGO. Why they don't have a humanitarian affairs unit, I don't know, but they want to be more foresight and futures oriented. And to me, there's so many principles here that are related to anticipatory aid or to anticipatory action of like, look, we know there's going to be climate crises, refugee crises, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. And maybe the NGO community is finally getting around to let's being proactive in this instead of reactive. So, do you have anyone within your community, within your group that you could put me in contact with that are moving this more to that, not so much the state government side of things, but the more private sector that is doing more anticipatory action, humanitarian aid? So those two questions, but maybe we just do that in an email, but verbally.
And I'll be quick. The quick answer is, Stephen, we need to do more of what we're doing now. Connecting dots, engaging with people to find who's doing what, where, having a sort of open forum. By all means, let's talk separately. The big thing I'm passionate about, and I want to put out there really, really strongly, there's a lot of this stuff going on at the moment, especially in the sort of NGO humanitarian space. It's all not on the African continent. We need to own it. It needs to be Africa owned. It needs to be connected here. It needs to be come from here, because we, that whole concept about used futures, we shouldn't be using other people's futures and foresighting work. So that's kind of my comment. Geci, any thoughts from you quickly before we go to Hadassah? Sorry.
No, in fact, I was going to mention on the first part regarding Kenya's interest. I'll definitely send you a connection. So there are conversations that have been happening, in fact, linked to UNESCO and the regional UNESCO office there. Around bringing futures literacy in more. I have less to say on the corporate side, as you know, Tanja, because I don't know anything. Maybe it's worth mentioning, though, that futures and futures literacy has become a very big thing in the humanitarian space,
Yeah.
so for obvious reasons. And so I'm aware that the Women's Refugee Commission, for example, globally, I think they're based in Canada, did an exercise beginning to look at some of these questions. And so it might also be worth just looking. There are a number of agencies around the world that have done very interesting work just over the last year.
Okay, thank you.
Hadassah.
Hi, thanks so much for a very interesting talk. I'm kind of here by mistake. I came across this, myself and Terence, my colleague Terence, are actually from the design department, multimedia design at UJ, and we're really interested in speculative futures and systemic design from a design side. So it's really interesting to see this type of work happening somewhere else in a completely different discipline. And I really think speculative design has a lot to give to this conversation. Terence is actually busy with his PhD in speculative design for
anticipatory
design.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm actually, speaking to a couple of these points is I think I'm just about to start a study with local neighborhoods. We're sort of working in anticipating sort of the effects from a very cultural position of, the implementation of, what we loosely term smart technologies into like local neighborhoods. But I think one thing that's interesting beyond that, what I think is very interesting is like these, when we talk about things like foresight and imagination, it's quite interesting because we also assume and we take for granted that it's easy to be imaginative, it's easy to have foresight, it's easy to think like that. And I'm coming from a design perspective because we almost have the opposite. It's hard for us to be like quantitative. It's hard for us to have that kind of mix. And I think this is something for, for us, we professional designers, and we're kind of versed in it, but it's something to take into account that being capable of thinking about the possible or the borders of what is even possible is also something, it is a skill, it's something that's got to be nurtured. It's not, if people struggle with it, it's a natural thing to struggle with these things. I think that's an important point from our side.
Yeah. And
one last thing, I think, Geci, we're going to hit you up. We're going to invite you over here to UJ very soon for a talk.
Well, the help may be closer than you think, because I've actually been doing some interesting work with one of your colleagues at Architecture, Tiresh Govender, and we've been looking at
very well.
The role of representation and imagination in thinking about the future. We focus on the smart city. I mentioned I do urban work, and so we've done some interesting little exercises. We must absolutely connect around that. And then I think to your point about capability, that in fact, so Riel Miller, who's one of the big names in the futures literacy space, this point about there being an actual capacity to build here, similar to, he often talks about reading and writing. And it's exactly to your point. It is not something that, sort of just happens. It's something that one can build. It's a muscle one can work and build up. And so that's a really important thing for him in how he thinks about futures literacy. And he literally does refer to it not as a methodology or a tool, but as a capability.
And sorry, Geci, I just have to jump in. What's so nice, it's in the sense of Amartya Sen's definition of, of his work around capabilities, because it's about development essentially then, and about the expansion of freedoms, and freedoms to be and to do, and to shape futures. And that brings me back to, that is precisely what we should be doing on the continent, not allowing other people to do it for us. Anybody else? Are there any other? Thank you so much. Hadassah and Terence. It was Terence, isn't it?
Yeah.
Super. And do check out on Google, if you haven't yet, Andrew Morrison at Andrew Morrison, Oslo Design School.
Yes, I actually met him 2 years ago in Cape Town.
Super.
He was out here for a conference.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Also big there. And they do some amazing work, as do OCAD in Canada. Anybody else? We'd love your thoughts. And then if you know of any little examples, people, it can be tiny. Remember what I said about the seeds, these little pockets of the future in the present. So even if it is a thought, honestly, if it's somebody thinking differently, taking a different approach, a little experiment, a project, a little community thing. Share that with us if it ticks, even if it ticks some of the anticipatory governance boxes, because we like collecting these seeds. So share that either in the chat box. I've got a hand. Tarisai, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes, you pronounce it correctly. So I'm a student at Powys in Algeria. I'm doing my master's thesis. So I've been working on a topic that is under the frame of a project where they are trying to introduce a new type of technology in the agriculture sector. It's called agro-photovoltaics. So I'm a policy student. I'm a water policy student. So my study or my thesis was focusing on trying to see if they do introduce this technology, what are some of the aspects that are quite new and not really embraced within the policy framework for that country? So while undertaking my study, I had no idea that it is directly linked to this notion you're talking about of anticipatory governance. So for me, I was looking at the water, energy, food nexus aspect and trying to see if they introduce this new technology, how will these three different sectors, that is the water, energy, and food sectors, how will they work together in terms of policy coherence and intersectoral coordination? So I'm actually about to finish the project and defend it very soon. So I was finding it difficult to talk about the governance aspect because it looked like it's future oriented. I was struggling to find a term. So then luckily I just came across your webinar and you're talking about this idea of anticipatory governance. And it's something that I never came across when we were doing my course content. So thank you so much for your presentation because it has calmed some of my fears before my defense, because I was like, okay, we've never been taught this, but what I'm looking at is future oriented. So what is that? So thank you so much. So this is what I can eat.
Oh, brilliant. I'm so happy, Tarisai, that we could help. On the course, all the source documentation and links to source documentation and open source academic papers are all to be found there. Geci, any final closing thoughts from your side?
No, I mean, I think the only thing I'd say, and in a way, Tarisai, it's partly to your little story here, is that, you know, on the one hand, the ideas, and Tanja gave some definitions around anticipatory governance are new as a framing, but they're not really new as an idea. But I think they do give some useful framing that can be applied to different issues, some of which are traditional questions, if you want, in strategic foresight, some of which might fall into innovation studies or technology transfer, you know, like you're looking at, or that may fall into various sectoral issues and considerations of the future. I think what it does is take a nice institutional, if you want, perspective on it. I think that the applications and this idea of collecting these cases, I think is really good, because I think where we can begin to see these public applications, I don't necessarily mean public as only government, but, you know, these kind of societal, sort of institutional engagement, I think it's really, really helpful. So it's kind of nice to see the enthusiasm of the response to the course, but also to attending a conversation like this in the various sectors and angles people are coming from, because I think that's what it does. It allows us to contain, or not to contain perhaps. You know, often these things happen very either sectorally, or it's a particular kind of action, it's a corporate conversation or it's a government conversation. I think what anticipatory governance does allow us to do is to have a much more collective, if you want, conversation that could be very generative. And so I'm quite excited about the space, and I'm quite excited just around the participation here. So thanks, Tanja, for inviting me.
Oh, it's been fantastic, Geci. We couldn't do this without you, truly. So 3 minutes to go. I'm going to just thank everybody, and thank you for those that shared links. I'm just going to review that quickly in the chat box. Rumina has shared a link to her work. We got, thank you, there's a paper. Geshi's shared a link to the Foresight for Development site, and it's got social media. It's a platform and it's got lovely social media. Please do go and have a surf around. And top tip, go to the little section called Read and then Bibliozone. And you'll see lots and lots of sort of thematic futures work. So For example, this, there's the future of water, the future of food, all these issues, and a little bit's categorized to for sense making. And some of the links might be a little bit old, but the point is there's a massive work, and be brave when you're surfing through there. Thank you for sharing that link. Mike has shared the link to the course in case you're interested in doing that. And again, the course, thank you, Joy, hugely. Joy's done an enormously huge amount of work putting all the material and the videos and everything in the one spot where it's user-friendly and easy to get to, and you can do all of this in your own time. And what I've just done, I've shared the website of Center for Sustainability Transitions, because yes, I think we've got some of our PhD students on the webinar, if I'm not mistaken. So 2 minutes to go, we're ending on time. Thank you ever so much. And yes, please go forth and be anticipatory, work with emergence, navigate complexity, and let's be humble about our futures, but absolutely let's do it for ourselves.